Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well, and welcome to yet another installment of Jean Talks About Whatever She Wants. And today we are going to be talking about the MCU Disney Plus shows, because yes, we did have the season finale of Loki a couple of weeks ago. So now that we have seen the first 3 Marvel Disney Plus series, I thought it'd be a fun idea to go through my thoughts on all 3 of them, give you guys my comparisons before ultimately giving you guys my ranking of the shows so far. Now, because I already have separate reviews for all of the episodes of all 3 shows, I'm not going to be delving into the individual plot points, the nitty gritty too much in this video, but I am going to be keeping in mind this kind of arbitrary criteria. This kind of criteria that doesn't really mean anything, but I made it up, okay? And that will help me determine how I rank each 3 of these shows in my list. So we're going to be going through all of that, as well as just my overall thoughts on the shows, especially in hindsight, now that some time has passed, in particular in the case of WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier. But before we delve into all of this, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. And if you enjoy the crazier, wackier videos that I make like this, if you could go ahead and give it a like, that would really help the channel and I would really appreciate it. And of course, as per usual, in the comments you can let me know down below how you would rank the Marvel Disney Plus series so far. But without further ado, let's dive into my comparison of WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and Loki. Okay, so first of all, like I said, for this video I did come up with a few kind of criteria in order to determine how I would rank each of these shows. It's not that serious. Like, really, it's not that serious. It really doesn't matter, but just to give this video a little bit of structure, I thought I would go ahead and determine what criteria I would be judging the shows by, and that's how we're going to be ordering the video instead of, you know, talking about the shows individually. So the first category up is a cheeky, light-hearted one in the score, the music, the themes of the shows. Now, first one up, we're going to be judging WandaVision because of course it was the first show to come out, and I feel like overall the score for WandaVision was kind of forgettable. Like, I can't remember it, okay? And I think the main reason for that is because of course each episode was basically inspired by a sitcom from the 1950s onwards to the early 2010s, and so it makes sense then that there wasn't really a set theme for each episode that would become memorable as we watch the episodes go by. Instead, they kind of changed the musical cues used in order to act as an inspiration from various sitcoms of that time, and so we didn't really get consistency or a lot of consistency in the music throughout the episodes, at least until the end theme where we got the Please Stand By that everyone dreaded as the weeks went on, okay? We got that kind of haunting, witchy music, which was cute, but otherwise, like, I wouldn't say WandaVision is a strong contender for best theme. And then we move on to Falcon and the Winter Soldier. This is a contender. Okay, this is a contender because I feel like Henry Jackman did the work, did the job in terms of bringing the, you know, Captain America Winter Soldier elements to the music of this show, but at the same time giving us something new and something fresh. It definitely felt like it came from the bowels of the Captain America franchise. Because you have that consistency of Henry Jackman also working on this score, you get that kind of continuity from Captain America the Winter Soldier, but at the same time, like I said, there's something new, there's something fresh there, and it was really impactful and energetic, and I really appreciated it. So I love the Falcon and the Winter Soldier theme. It is a contender, but ultimately, let's be real, ultimately, come on now, let's be honest. Come on now, let's all be honest here. The best theme of all of the Disney Plus shows so far, hands down, no questions asked, is the Loki theme. It's the Loki. What? Are you kidding me? Natalie Holt put the special kind of crack in the Loki theme. I've been listening to that theme for like a month now on my walks, okay? On my daily walks. I love it. It makes you feel like this powerful god. And I mentioned before in a previous review of a Loki episode that there are kind of these Doctor Who-isms in there as well, which makes perfect sense because of course he's the Time Lord and this series is all about time travel. So there's all kinds of inspiration there. I I also recently rewatched all of the Thor films, which I should have done before watching Loki, but whatever. I recently rewatched them since the finale, and I did hear some cues from like the Thor Ragnarok theme, for example. So she drew in elements from all of this mythos and created this incredible theme. I truly think it is the best of all of the three shows, hands down. But like I said, my runner-up would definitely be the Falcon and the Winter Soldier theme as well. Okay, so after that little icebreaker, it's time to get a little bit more serious, and the next category up is character arcs and character portrayals. Now, straight up, I have to say, out of all three shows and their main characters, 100% WandaVision did the character of Wanda the most justice. The arc that Wanda goes through in this series is truly phenomenal. From this character who is just so grief-stricken, and we'll talk about the themes that are explored in all three series later on, but this character is just so grief-stricken because she's lost so much. She's lost to everyone who has ever meant anything to her, that she creates this whole new world. She creates this whole new pocket dimension in order to escape from the realities of her life, from the realities of her trauma. And so I feel like the journey that we're taken on throughout the series of WandaVision, seeing Wanda kind of adapting to all of these different decades, but at the same time still being kind of trapped by her own grief, despite all of the scenery, despite all of the sets and the storylines that she creates in order to lose herself in. At the end of the day, the baseline of this whole creation stems from grief. It stems from loss and her inability to cope with that grief. And I feel like that's just a powerful character arc to bring any character through. But in the case of Wanda, someone who has lost so much within the MCU, I mean, Zemo in Falcon the Winter Soldier reveals that the country of Sokovia itself no longer exists. So Wanda has literally lost so much. She's even lost her own country. I feel like this whole arc was so fitting for the character. And then you want to talk about portrayals. Elizabeth Olsen did the actoring. Elizabeth Olsen did she understood the assignment. She said, okay, you're giving me material now, I'm going to rise to the occasion. She absolutely did. She definitely rose to the occasion with the material that she was given in this series. I think her performance was excellent, especially considering that she had to adapt this character to different decades of television and of iconic sitcoms. I mean, already you're being compared to, you know, characters from the Dick Van Dyke Show, so already you have this pressure to deliver on that comparison. But at the same time, you have to remember that this isn't just like a random character. This is a character that people love in Wanda Maximoff, and so you have to act like her but from different decades in this fantasy world. And she's also impersonating the mannerisms of actresses that she would have seen in her beloved sitcoms. So it's a very layered performance, and at the same time, as the series goes on, she's kind of breaking through a little bit more as this fantasy world comes crashing down around her, and so she also has to convey that. It's just phenomenal. It's just amazing. I think Elizabeth Olsen was 100% deserving of her Emmy nomination. Now, I would also like to point out that I don't think there was a bad performance amongst any of these, I guess, 5 characters, if we're considering, you know, Wanda and Vision and Sam and Bucky and Loki. There wasn't a bad performance amongst any of them. I would say the second strongest contender would likely be Tom Hiddleston as Loki. He has this character down pat at the end of the day. Like, let's be real, I did just say that I rewatched all of the Thor films, and it was just incredible to see the character grow as the films went on. He really was the kind of shining star, the crown jewel of the Thor franchise, more so than even Thor at some points. So it is great to see him have his own show and be rewarded in that way. But my criticism of the portrayal and of the arc that the character goes through in the Loki series has always been that it doesn't really feel true to the character of Loki as we know him from the MCU previously. And having rewatched the Thor films, like, I can reaffirm that. Like, I was right. That has always been my kind of criticism of the way that the character of Loki was kind of written and portrayed in the series. And also, as I mentioned in my review of the finale of Loki, my issue with the whole premise being that this was supposed to be 2012 Loki, that would have meant that he would have been the most like evil that we would have ever seen Loki, and yet that's not reflected in the series overall. But kind of putting all of that aside and accepting that this is the Loki that we get in this series, I do think that Tom Hiddleston, like, he also was doing the actoring. Let's be real, like, he was also doing the actoring reassuring. He's such a charismatic lead. Loki has always been a scene stealer in the Thor films, and it shows just how much charisma and just how much Tom Hiddleston embodies this character, that he was able to lead his own series, and throughout the entirety of it we were captivated by his performance. Now, in terms of Sam and Bucky, they're a tricky one. Okay, they're a tricky pairing because, you know, even though WandaVision is supposed to be about Wanda and Vision, it's clearly a story that is driven by Wanda's grief and, you know, her character arc throughout this journey. So it's not really about Vision as much as it is about Wanda, and it makes sense that her name comes first in this title. But in the case of the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, I mean, I guess again the Falcon is first in the title, so it makes sense that the story would focus more on him. And another thing to remember, of course, is that whilst we've had a lot of time to explore the character of Bucky in the Captain America films, we didn't really explore the character of Sam Wilson to the same extent. So it makes sense that the series kind of had to do a lot of catching up in order to flesh out the character of Sam. But as a result, it doesn't really feel like a Falcon and the Winter Soldier story. I've already said that I feel like there was a lot of Bucky's, you know, mental health journey that was kind of cut from the series, and so by the end, when we reach that point where he's kind of come to terms with the journey, the mental health journey that he was supposed to go on throughout the series, it doesn't really feel earned because we didn't see a lot of that journey. Like, we saw some of it at the beginning, and then we were led to believe that that would continue, but that really just didn't happen. We got sidetracked with the whole Flag Smashers storyline, and then in the end he kind of comes back to it, and there's this look of satisfaction that doesn't really feel earned. So I feel like, you know, Bucky was definitely done a little bit of a disservice in the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but I feel like Sam definitely thrived in this kind of backdrop, in this kind of environment where we were able to really flesh out the character a little bit more and understand what Sam's motivations were. And I think it is absolutely earned by the end when we see him as Captain America, because we've really delved into what it means to have a black Captain America, what it means for Sam to hold that mantle, and also what it means for the MCU at large to have this change. Okay, so the next category up, we have world building and how important each of these shows were in terms of determining or setting up the future of the MCU. Now, the first series that we're going to go through, of course, has to be Falcon and the Winter Soldier, because this overall was a much smaller, more contained story. It doesn't really dive into what we can expect from phase 4 of the MCU a lot in terms of, you know, trying to set up a new storyline that will be really impactful and really exciting to see down the line. That's not really what it does here. Instead, it unpacks a very small, intimate moment that takes place at the end of Avengers Endgame between Sam and Steve and Bucky, and really delves into it in a lot of depth. I feel like that's what Falcon and the Winter Soldier does well, is it goes for depth rather than breadth, but as a result, when it comes to the implications of the story, they're very minimal. In terms of setting up, you know, future things to get excited about, I feel like, you know, the angle of Valentina, who's portrayed by Julia Louis-Dreyfus, I can never say her name. I can never say her name. Her name is such a tongue twister. But the entrance of that character does suggest that perhaps one day we may see a Thunderbolts, or we may see a Dark Avengers, okay, which are these like alternate evil versions of the Avengers that are all propaganda, but then, you know, below the surface there's like evil amok. So we might be getting some of that later down the line. I would guess like phase 5 at this point, because phase 4 is pretty set. So that's something to get excited about. But ultimately, when it comes to Sam and Bucky, and in terms of their roles in the MCU in the future, I think the most exciting part is the fact that, you know, Sam is now officially Captain America with his own uniform. As a result, we can officially get excited to see Sam and his Captain America adventures. They've already announced that there will be a Captain America movie. I hope this movie is theatrically released and doesn't just get landed on Disney Plus, although I have a suspicion that that might be the case, but we'll see. Okay, it's very early days, and honestly, speaking of early days, I don't know when this film is due to come out, because like I said, phase 4 is already set and phase 5 is already looking a bit crowded, but Disney will work it out. Okay, the MCU will work it out, but we are expecting to see see him on his Captain America journeys, and I'm assuming Bucky will come along with. But in terms of, you know, important story beats and world building, you know, Falcon and the Winter Soldier doesn't really do a lot of that, especially because it kind of wraps up the Super Soldier storyline pretty definitely like pretty conclusively with the destruction of all of these super soldiers apart from Bucky, so they can't really go in many directions there either. So next up, in terms of world building, I would say it's WandaVision, because it definitely sets up a lot to get excited about in terms of Wanda's role in the MCU in the future. Of course, we already know that she's going to be making an appearance in Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. But speaking of the multiverse, I think a lot of us did think that WandaVision would do a better job of setting up the multiverse, perhaps her creating a multiverse as a result of the hex that she created on the show. And perhaps an example of this would have been in the form of Quicksilver, the Quicksilver that we see from the Fox universe, making an appearance in WandaVision. But ultimately they didn't really do that. They didn't go in that direction, much to a lot of us's dismay. We were all pretty upset about that turn of events, unfortunately. So even though Wanda herself will be playing a role in the future, in the near future of the MCU, and we look forward to seeing what that might be, in terms of setting up the multiverse, the series didn't really do that. And in terms of introducing powerful yet unknown characters like Mephisto, which a lot of people believe to be the case for the series also didn't really do that. The series introduced us to the character of Agatha Harkness, who may come to be a really important player in the future of the MCU, especially considering how popular the character ended up being. But still, considering how people believed that, you know, the introduction of Mephisto would take place in this show and he would play a huge role potentially in phase 4 and 5 of the MCU, I feel like in reality it was much more small and contained in terms of the world building. And like I said, it wholly focuses on Wanda and her role in Doctor Strange 2, and potentially even in Spider-Man, if that's how they set things up. And in terms of the Vision side of things, you know, we now have a new Vision who has the memories of the old Vision, but a whole new all-white body. And I guess that's something to be excited about if you like really care about Vision. I'm kind of over him now. Like, I would have been good with him just leaving, like going forever for good at the end of the show, but he's still around. I guess he's flying about, and they kind of left it open-ended just in case they wanted to bring the character back. But in terms of a series that really set up the future of the MCU, in terms of a series that really gave us consequences, that really blew our mind, wow, it's Loki. It has to be Loki. Are you kidding? Did you watch the finale? Did you watch the season finale of Loki? Kang? What? First of all, we got the introduction of this idea of various versions of the same character, like the reality of the multiverse. The fact that you have a character like Loki, who again, we've come to know and love over the course of the Thor films. The fact that we got to see various versions of him, these variants of the character, was already a big deal. It was already huge because, like I said, we had anticipated that to be the case for Quicksilver, but instead it was passed on to Loki. So all of the things that we thought was going to happen in WandaVision ended up happening in Loki, apart from Mephisto. But anyways, but then you have the introduction of this TVA who controls like the timelines, and there's this one sacred timeline. So then the question becomes, well, who made this sacred timeline? Who actually created it? And at first we think it's the timekeepers, but no. Then it ends up being who but Kang, or at least a variant of Kang, who, yes, is portrayed by Jonathan Majors on the show, blowing our minds. Just blowing our minds. Loki 1000% wins when it comes to this category of world building, of setting up the future of the MCU and giving us a ton to be excited about. And also, yet another reason to get excited for Loki is that this is actually the only of the 3 shows, at least at the time of filming, that has been confirmed for a season 2. So we are already invested in the show more so than some of these others, because we know there's going to be a follow-up, on top of the fact that, of course, a lot of the themes and story beats that are explored in the show are going to be making an appearance in the movies in a big way. Okay, so for our next category, this is yet another one that doesn't really have a lot of stakes. Okay, it's not the biggest deal, but it is something that I was still looking out for in terms of the overall quality of the show, and that was the action sequences in each of these series. Hands hands down, I have to say that the winner in this category is the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I've always preferred me some good hand-to-hand combat sequences that feel like they have the weight, they feel like the punches land. I feel like when you have a character like Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier, you have the opportunity to bring those action sequences to life. I mean, we saw how effective they were in Captain America the Winter Soldier, which is still to this day, in my opinion, the film that has the best action sequences, not because of the kind of grandness or the stakes or anything, but because of just how effective and just how impactful and palpable they feel. They feel like they're actually happening, whereas with a lot of like CG heavy action sequences that we see in the MCU and indeed in the superhero genre overall, they don't feel palpable, and so they lose some of their effect, really. Even though of course we all get a kick out of the spectacle, it doesn't feel like it's actually happening, and therefore the weight of it is kind of lost. But in the case of the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we get several great action sequences that do feel real, and we also get that incredible opening sequence with Sam Wilson finally getting the moment in the sun that he deserves with his flight sequence at the beginning of episode 1. I feel like that flight sequence was truly phenomenal. That was a sequence that I would have loved to see on the big screen. Like, it was incredible how they were able to do that in the daylight, because let's not forget, oftentimes these CG heavy sequences take place in like darkness to hide any wobbly CG effects, but that sequence took place in like broad daylight, in like the desert, where the light was reflecting so beautifully on his wings. It was truly astounding. So I feel like that was one of the best sequences in the whole show, but already just that sequence alone was better than anything else in WandaVision, in Loki. Please, like, I love those other shows, don't get me wrong, okay, but what in WandaVision matched up to the Falcon flight sequence in Falcon and the Winter Soldier? Like, what the sequences in WandaVision felt so fake, okay? Oftentimes you can feel the wire work. Like, it didn't really feel real or impactful or weighted, and so that's my issue with a lot of the fight sequences in WandaVision. Plus the choreography wasn't there, it wasn't impressive. I mean, she's not that kind of character. That's the thing, is that like with Sam and Bucky, they're trained fighters, so you expect them to fight like that, whereas in the case of Wanda, she's like, you know, a witch. Like, she's the Scarlet Witch. You don't expect her to break out in karate, although technically she could because she trained with the Avengers, but whatever, you don't really expect that from her. So, you know, what you get instead are these kind of special effects heavy sequences, especially in the finale, but it very much felt like they were in a room with like a green screen and they were doing, you know, some wire work, and that's all fun and games, that's cute, but I wouldn't say that it felt palpable or real to me, and as a result the stakes kind of felt diminished. And in the case of Loki, they tried to kind of create a hybrid of the two, where Loki does have some fight sequences, especially through the character of Sylvie, and Loki himself as well. It seems as though, you know, he's an Asgardian, he would have had the basic Asgardian training, I assume. Like, I'm not an expert in Asgardian training, but I assume he would have gotten some as like a prince of Asgard, and so I'm assuming that he's able to kick butt even when he doesn't have his powers, but you wouldn't know it. Like, you really wouldn't know it through the choreography in Loki. Like, you wouldn't know it, okay? I feel like the choreography was bad. Even in the case of Sylvie, like, I feel like she wouldn't go up against the Winter Soldier. Are you kidding me? She wouldn't last a second. Like, really? You think Sylvie would last a second? And she's supposed to be the superior Loki, so like, what's going on? What's going on over there? So I feel like, yeah, when it comes to the hand-to-hand combat, it was no. When it comes to the magical scenes as well, I've already talked about this ad nauseum at this point, but I just feel like the magic was wasted. I feel like Loki's use of magic was inconsistent. At times he was incredibly powerful and impressive, and then most of the time he was just doing these cute little tricks that felt like something you would see like a birthday magician do, as opposed to like a god, an Asgardian god that was trained by Frigga. What? I'm very upset by this. And also, having watched the Thor films, as I keep mentioning, I noticed that the series never really gave us a scene where Loki duplicates himself. Like, he mentions it in episode 2 when Mobius is going through all the power sets of a Loki, and he corrects Mobius and says that it's a different thing that he does, whatever, I can't remember, but we never actually get to see him do it. Like, is the budget really that strict? Like, we couldn't even get one scene where Loki duplicates himself, even though that's his signature move. I feel like that's kind of rude. So again, when it comes to the magical aspect of the action sequences as well, they were lacking. Now, of course, as I've said multiple times before, the real GOAT when it comes to the magic that was used in the Loki series was, of course, classic Loki, portrayed by Richard E. Grant. And so just for the sheer greatness of that moment, that scene in episode 5, I believe, of the series, I would say that Loki ranks higher in this category than WandaVision. So I would put Falcon and the Winter Soldier first, and then Loki, and then WandaVision right at the bottom in terms of action sequences. So for the next category, we're back to the writing, we're back to exploring these stories of these series, and we're going to be delving into the themes of each of the shows. Now, like I said, I have reviews for each of these shows, so if you really want to hear my thoughts on the themes, that's something that I often talk about in my reviews, so you can go ahead and check those out. But overall, I would say that when it comes to WandaVision, of course, we have the theme of grief being central to this series, as well as the theme of, you know, trying to move on, trying to cope through grief and loss and PTSD at the end of the day. And that's something that I did kind of notice when it came to the Disney Plus series overall, is that, you know, everyone needs therapy. Everyone needs and gets therapy on these Disney Plus shows. If your character needs therapy, get them a Disney Plus series, because that's the only time that they'll be able to do it, because in the films they're just so fast paced and you're focused on all of these grand storylines that are larger than each of these characters, that you don't really have time to delve into the psyche of each character. So I feel like that's something that the Disney Plus series do excellently, is exploring the psyche of these side characters that we've seen throughout the MCU films. And in the case of WandaVision, I think that journey was just so beautiful for the character of Wanda, her coming to terms with all that she has lost and trying to fill these holes, but at the end of the day accepting that she can't force a whole town of innocent people force a whole town of innocent people to do her bidding just so she can live out this fantasy, because at the end of the day it's not real, and she needs to deal with the root of the issue, which is her mourning those that she has loved and lost. As I said, I do feel like the character of Vision kind of gets the short end of the stick when it comes to the writing in WandaVision, but I would say that they kind of try to tread into the realm of exploring Vision's autonomy. I feel like they could have done a better job of that, honestly, but exploring the idea that at the end of the day, Vision has never really been allowed to really assert his own autonomy. Like, if you think about it, even just Jarvis, the kind of first iteration of this character within the MCU, you know, he was designed to be of service to Tony Stark. Like, he was designed to be Tony's AI butler. He didn't really have an identity of his own. And then we shift over to Avengers Age of Ultron, where he became Ultron, but then he was also Jarvis, but kind of destroyed by Ultron. And then he was turned into Vision, which was this kind of mishmash of magic and Ultron and Jarvis and vibranium. And he still never really had a chance to kind of discover himself and to assert his own autonomy as a person, as a being. He was still kind of there in service of the Avengers and in service of Tony Stark. So again, he never really got to be his own person. And then through WandaVision, it's just an even bigger violation of his rights, if he even has any, because even beyond the grave, even after the guy has died, he's been kind of reanimated in service of Wanda's needs, in service of, you know, being her, you know, idyllic husband in this, you know, retro lifestyle that she wants to live in order to escape the realities and the traumas of her life. And as a result, throughout the series, he still doesn't have this autonomy. And in a lot of ways, the series is also about him breaking through Wanda's spell and, you know, regaining his sense of self and autonomy. And then lastly, we have the final iteration of the character as of yet, where he has this whole new body, but with the memories and the experiences that Vision once had. And so now we have this kind of debate at the end of the show where Vision is arguing with Vision about what it means to be the same person. Are they the same person? What's going on? That kind of philosophical argument that happens, and then ultimately White Vision goes off to kind of discover that for himself. And let's see what becomes of the character now that he is, I guess, a fully autonomous being. And then next up we have Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and the themes in that series were even more explicit, and I absolutely loved that. I feel like this is where Falcon and the Winter Soldier really shone for me when it comes to exploring these real life, real world issues that impact both the real world and also apparently the MCU, because of course at its core, especially on one side of things, it was a story about about Sam discovering what it means for a man like him, a black man in America who's from the South, to be Captain America. And again, like I said, it kind of delves into that small little moment that we got at the end of Avengers Endgame, but this time exploring the real world implications, the historical context, and Sam coming to terms with how to deal with all of the implications of being a black Captain America, and all of that historical context that is explored throughout the series through characters like Isaiah Bradley, drawing comparisons to real life events like the Tuskegee experiments. I love that stuff. I love it when genre filmmaking or genre television delves into real world context. And I think another great example of that was last year's Lovecraft's Country, another series that I did extensive reviews for. And again, each week as the episodes went on, I was just learning so much about Black American history. And that's something that I really appreciated about the series, which has this kind of backdrop of the horror genre. And I feel like in the case of Falcon and the Winter Soldier, it does a similar thing, but this time around with the backdrop of an MCU superhero show. And then of course with the character of Bucky Barnes, you have the exploration of mental health once again, especially PTSD, all of the trauma that he went through. But as I mentioned before, I feel like that's done a little bit of a disservice in the series because the character doesn't really get a lot of spotlight in the show. But still, I do feel like it is kind of commendable that the series would delve into that aspect of the character and really hone in on the fact that this is someone who was tortured for like decades. Like, he was forced to do these things against his will for decades, and now he's living with the repercussions of that even well after Hydra has fallen. And finally, of course, we have Loki. And in terms of the themes that are explored in Loki, I mean, I've already talked about it relatively recently, but we have, you know, free will versus predeterminism. We have self-identity and the idea of Loki finally finding a peace within himself and acceptance within himself, and also him falling in love with another version of himself. Like, does that mean that he's finally learned how to love and appreciate himself as well? There's a lot of things going on with Loki, but I will say that in terms of consistency and in terms of how clear the message really was, I would give this point actually to Falcon and the Winter Soldier and their exploration of race within the MCU, hands down. I might be biased, but you're gonna have to deal with that. You're just gonna have to deal with it, because I feel like the exploration of predeterminism in Loki was kind of lost midway through the series and kind of came up again with the entrance of Kang, or at least this version of Kang. So I feel like it wasn't as consistent as the race talk in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, so I'm gonna give it to that. Okay, so for our second to last category, we have the side characters, the supporting cast in each of these series. So first of all, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of supporting cast for these MCU Disney Plus shows would have to be Agatha Harkness. Would have to be Kathryn Hahn's incredible entrance into the MCU as Agatha Harkness, because honestly, like, she was a moment. Like, honestly, she was a mood, she was a moment, she was everything. Now, I do have one critique of the character, which we'll get into later on, but in terms of Kathryn Hahn's portrayal of the character, like, faultless, perfect. Like, are you kidding me? She played the nosy neighbor to a T, and she had just enough lurking right underneath the surface of that kindness and of that sugary sweet act to kind of raise your suspicions throughout the show. I think she did an excellent job of like teetering on the edge of being someone you can't really trust, like something's going on there. And even if you don't know a lot about the character of Agatha Harkness from the comics, like me I had to look her up because of this series, and you do still get the sense that something's not right. And another great entry into the MCU that we got through WandaVision was kind of like a re-entry, I guess, in the form of Monica Rambeau. Yes, my good sis, okay, my good sis Monica, who has her own superhero origin story in this series. And again, I would have liked to see way more of her throughout the show, but I do feel like what we got was really encouraging. I am super excited to see her in the Marvels, the sequel to Captain Marvel in, I think, a couple of years now. And in terms of these side characters in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, the main one that kind of stands out to me is 1000% Zemo, but he would get into my next category, so we're not going to really delve into him in a lot of depth here. But absolutely, like, the re-entry of Zemo into the MCU was very much welcomed. I think Daniel Bruhl did the thing, like he did what needed to be done. He did something new with the character. He became a meme. He was a cultural reset. Like, he did everything that he needed to be done and more. I really enjoyed the character of Zemo, and I loved it when Sam, Bucky and Zemo were working together. I knew it would be short-lived. I knew I would look like Boo Boo the Fool when he inevitably betrayed them, but man, like, I was fine with looking like Boo Boo the Fool if it meant that I'd get a whole episode of them working together. Like, I was okay with it because they were great. They had a great team dynamic. The fact that Zemo seems to have gotten some kind of African-American history class during his time in German prison was hilarious to me. So I really enjoyed this character, and I love the way that they interacted with each other throughout the series. But ultimately we got that betrayal, and it was like, yeah, of course he has a whole other plan in mind, but still, it was fun while it lasted. It was absolutely fun while it lasted. And finally, when it comes to Loki, I mean, I think we've all fallen in love with Mobius, okay? We all loved Owen Wilson's entry into the MCU, and we loved seeing Loki and Mobius work together. Honestly, I would have expected to see more of them working together, considering how heavily they were featured in the trailers. I thought it was going to be more of them kind of going through time and seeing various versions of Loki, and trying to kind of capture them or interact with them in some way, but I would have liked to see more of that. Basically, the sequence that we got with them in Vesuvius, I expected the series to have a lot more of that, but ultimately, you know, the series kind of diverges, and instead we get Sylvie Sylvie as like a major player in the show, and all you need to do is take a look at my face to know how I feel about that. I hated Sylvie. I actually think she might be the character that I hate the most in all of these shows. I hated Sylvie so much. Like, I hated her. Okay, I just don't find her to be impressive, charismatic. I think of all of the performances that I've praised in all of these Disney Plus series, I don't think Sophia DiMartino did the character, or at least what the character was supposed to be, justice. I don't feel like she was very charismatic in this role. I saw no redeeming qualities in her. And then when she ends up ultimately portraying Loki, it's like, oh, I hated the character even more. I will say still that in terms of side characters, Loki may take the win, just because like the cast overall was so excellent. I loved Gugu and Raw in this role, although again, I would have liked to see more of her. I loved Wunmi Musaku as Hunter B-15. Please, we are all team Wunmi in this household. Like, please. I hope you understand that at this point. Like, speaking of Lovecraft Country, we're all team Wunmi in this household. So loved her being in the MCU and being on this show. 1000%. That was always going to get extra points. And I think the biggest criticism of the side characters in the Loki series is that we don't get enough of them. And that's a pretty okay criticism to have. And then of course you have the other versions of Loki himself, like classic Loki, who's the like MVP. Okay, we love to see him. And then you also have Crocodile Loki or Alligator Loki, I don't know, but he's kind of an MVP too. I was kind of vibing with that character. You have Kid Loki, and then you have one of my other favorites, President Loki. Listen, President Loki is excellent, and he's also portrayed by Tom Hiddleston, so like again, the versatility is incredible. And next up, finally, for the last category of this entire ranking, we have the villains of the show. Now, I have to say up front, I feel like the villains were largely underwhelming in all three of the Disney Plus shows. I feel like they were definitely the weak link when it comes to each of these shows, and I'll explain why. So the first runner-up, we have WandaVision, and this is an interesting situation because in actuality, the true villain of WandaVision is Wanda. The true bad guy of WandaVision WandaVision is Wanda. Because if we look to Agatha Harkness as being the bad guy, it doesn't quite make sense to have her be the true villain of the show, because she's kind of just a spectator of what Wanda's actually doing. Now, throughout the series, we all had these crazy theories about who the ultimate big bad of WandaVision would be. And of course, the word Mephisto, the words nightmare, Mephisto, all sorts were thrown around. But I think the reason why people wanted a Mephisto to be behind it all is because it would explain why Wanda was doing everything, and it would also explain Agatha Harkness's involvement to begin with, because it would assume that she would be like this kind of sidekick, this kind of henchwoman to the ultimate big bad, and therefore was trying to help that big bad, you know, get control of Wanda, or at least maintain control of her as she lived her idyllic life in their hex. Like, that kind of setup makes sense. But in reality, we ended up getting an Agatha Harkness who was just there because she was drawn to the massive amounts of power that Wanda had created through the hex, and as a result she wanted to find out how Wanda did everything. But like, why? Like, why? We never really got to find out what Agatha's motives were. We never really got to find out why Agatha wanted to kind of dissect how Wanda had created the hex to begin with, and why Agatha wanted to like go back in time through Wanda's worst hits in order to find out where the source of her powers came from. It very much felt like a way to introduce the concept of the Scarlet Witch into the MCU, as opposed to a way to explain Agatha Harkness's motives specifically. So yeah, I feel like Agatha Harkness as a villain doesn't really make sense, because like, yeah, she was the nosy neighbor, but she wasn't controlling Wanda in any way, which is what a lot of us thought. She wasn't a part of some kind of mission to siphon Wanda's powers through the hex for a big bad to make use of in these mischievous ways. Like, that's not something that happened. Ultimately, she was just a spectator to Wanda's worst mistakes. Then we divert our attention over to the real villain of WandaVision, which is Wanda herself, as I said. We could also take a mini stop over to Hayworth, who was another villain in WandaVision, but he was mostly just a dickhead. He was mostly just a Nick Fury, but even more of a dickhead who had his own obscured interests in mind throughout the entirety of the series. But I wouldn't say he was like the bad guy of the show. The bad guy of the show was 100% Wanda. She took control of an entire town's minds and forced them to live out her psychotic fantasy land. Like, let's be real, Wanda is the bad guy. And it's kind of crazy to me because the MCU often explores themes of mind control, like how heinous taking away someone's autonomy really is. Like, for example, through the characters of Bucky Barnes and his stint as the Winter Soldier, also through Hawkeye in the first Avengers film, and even Loki, who was ultimately controlled himself by the Mind Stone through the first Avengers film. You know, we have a ton of these MCU characters who have undergone some kind of mind control or mind manipulation. Of course, the Black Widow program, as was recently explored in the film Black Widow. So then when you have a character like Wanda doing the same thing to a bunch of unsuspecting members of the public, and the fact that she's not treated like a villain by the end of the series is kind of a problem to me. Like, I understand that she was going through this mourning, loss, PTSD, blah blah blah, but like, ultimately she should have been locked up, right? And then when we move on to Falcon and the Winter Soldier, I already said this like on a weekly basis when I was reviewing the show, but I just felt like the Flag Smashers were bad villains. You have Carly, who's basically just this vessel for exposition, trying to explain the origins of the Flag Smashers and her own origin story, but not really giving us a chance to see any of it. Like, it's show, don't tell. But no, this character purely tells. She looks off into the middle distance and tells her story through these dispassionate monologues, and it's just not an effective storytelling method, at least not to establish, you know, the Flag Smashers as these formidable foes for Sam and Bucky to fight. So yeah, I feel like they just flopped in so many different ways. So many different ways. I just didn't care. Like, oh, here we go again. And whilst I did appreciate the idea that you have these villains who are morally not entirely objectionable, like, they have some good points. I think, you know, Marvel saw how successful they were in terms of creating Killmonger as a villain, as someone who you can kind of agree with, but at the same time, it's the means by which they're trying to get the ends that they wants that is unagreeable. I feel like they saw that and they were like, okay, let's do that with the character of Carly, but set in like a post-snap world. And I think it makes sense, but ultimately the execution just really wasn't there, whether it was for costs or time constraints or because of COVID somehow. I just feel like the Flash Smashers storyline was done a huge disservice. And then of course you have the secondary villain in the form of Zemo, and as I already said, I really liked him as like an anti-hero in this show. I think it is a shame that ultimately he was a bad guy, although was he really? I kind of forgive Zemo, honestly, but anyways, he doesn't want the powers of gods to be in the hands of fallible human beings, and so he manages to destroy super soldiers. And like, I kind of have respect for Zemo in terms of his like moral conviction, because he had a super soldier serum in his hands. He didn't take it, like he smashed it up. So my guy is actually full of conviction. He is actually true to his word. So I do have respect for him. Then finally we have the villain in Loki, who was ultimately He Who Remains, as portrayed by Jonathan Majors. Now this was a huge moment in the series. It definitely saved the series in a lot of ways for me, but that finale was so excellent that I forgave a lot of the issues that the series had overall, and I loved seeing Jonathan Majors' portrayal of this version of Kang. Of course it means we're going to be getting several portrayals of several versions of the character, but the first one up that we got was He Who Remains, who seems to be like a nicer version of Kang, who's someone who's a bit more level-headed. He's not as interested in conquest and conquering, but rather establishing order, and of course that means sacrificing free will. But he has happily made that sacrifice in favor of establishing order after the chaos that was created by the multiversal war. So in that sense, even though the character is technically a bad guy, at least through the eyes of his victims like Sylvie and like basically all of the Lokis who have been written to be the losers, but at the same time he's also yet another example of like an ambiguous bad guy, because ultimately like he was the lesser of two evils. Ultimately I kind of bought into his argument that like, if you kill me, someone worse is gonna pop up, so like what do you want to do, boo boo? And ultimately Sylvie made the wrong decision, because she's going to find out very quickly that the alternative to He Who Remains is far worse, because ultimately nature abhors a vacuum, and the vacuum that was created through the death of He Who Remains has quickly been filled by his worst alternative, Kang. So now that we've gone through all of my criteria for how I would rank the 3 MCU series that we have gotten so far, it's time to make the decision. Listen, no more dilly-dallying, okay? I procrastinated for long enough. It's time to decide once and for all how I would rank the first 3 MCU Disney Plus shows. At number 3 we have WandaVision. I feel like when it comes to WandaVision, whilst the premise was strong and interesting and the exploration of the character was done extremely well, that is the part of WandaVision I feel like excels above all the other shows. I just feel like ultimately, like, I don't think it's like the best series of all of the 3 shows personally, even though I do acknowledge that a lot of people do. I just think it didn't really live up for me, especially at the end, like in the second half of the show. There was a little bit that was lacking, and also when it came to like the twists surrounding Ralph Bone. And like I said, Agatha Harkness, whilst she is a cool character and Catherine Hahn acted the hell out of that role, I feel like ultimately she doesn't really make sense as a villain. But next up at number 2 we have Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Now I ranked the series very highly, I think, upon its release and upon the finale of the show, but you know, taking a look back and seeing what else has come out subsequently, I do feel like the kind of issues that I had with it initially kind of intensify over time. I would still say it is a very rewatchable series, and that's something that I can't really say about WandaVision, because like I ain't rewatching some of the early episodes of WandaVision, I'm so sorry. I just don't feel like it's as rewatchable as Falcon and the Winter Soldier is, especially with the banter between Sam and Bucky, like please. So then finally, of course, we have Loki at number 1. Yes, I do think that Loki has been the best series to date from the MCU Disney Plus lineup. But that's it from me. Now that I told you guys how I would rank/compare the first 3 MCU Disney Plus series, it's time for you guys to let me know how you would rank these shows down in the comments below, and any thoughts that you've had about these series overall. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.